Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and today I thought we could do another little animal spotlight kind of episode, similar to what I did with the goats. I want to talk about coyotes, really, because they have been showing up kind of everywhere in my reality lately, in dreams where conversation literally happens that I honestly couldn't really shake for even a few days later. Even on roadsides, there's spirit crossing between worlds in the way that roadkill has weirdly kind of always spoken to me. Really, it's like a language I've never fully understood, but have learned to honestly pay attention to. And these encounters aren't particularly random. I also came across a coyote track when I'm currently taking care of some animals for a family friend right now. And in front of the horse stables, there were some coyote tracks literally right in front of it. I know that seems super mundane, and it's very smart to not read into every single little sign that you get, but here I am choosing to read into it. So, after years of magical practice, I know when something is trying to get my attention. But here's what makes this particularly interesting. Coyotes are one of the few wild predators that haven't just survived human expansion, they've thrived because of it. While wolves retreated to remote wilderness, while mountain lions became increasingly rare, coyotes figured out how to live among us. They've expanded their range, increased their numbers, and learned to hunt in cities as successfully as they ever did in wild spaces. From a magical perspective, this makes them incredible teachers for our current moment in history. We're living through times of unprecedented change, environmental, technological, and social. The old ways of doing things aren't working anymore, but the new ways haven't fully emerged. This is exactly the kind of environment where coyote wisdom becomes essential. And today we're going to deep dive into working with coyote energy and spirit in magical practice. Not the sanitized, romanticized version you might find in other places, but I really want to talk about the real complex, sometimes even uncomfortable wisdom that these urban tricksters offer. We'll explore their role as boundary crossers, their mastery of adaptation, their relationship with death and transformation, even, and why they might be one of the most important animal allies for even modern witches. I want to be clear from the start that this isn't about cultural appropriation or claiming traditions that don't belong to me. I know coyote is very, very important to quite a few indigenous cultures. What I'm sharing comes from my own direct experiences and observations, not from any closed indigenous practices. This is about what coyotes themselves are teaching through their behavior, their presence, and their interactions with those willing to listen. So grab your drink and let's get into it. So, when an animal spirit decides to work with you, it rarely announces itself with dramatic fanfare. Instead, it begins to weave itself into the fabric of your reality in ways that, start subtle and become increasingly impossible to ignore. That's really the difference here. For me, the coyote calling began with a dream, not anything specific that I can recall. It was one of those dreams where honestly it happened. I know he was talking to me in a human voice and telling me something very important. Of course, I can't remember it, but I specifically remember waking up from the dream in the middle of the night and just keep whispering to myself, coyote, 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 because I didn't want to forget in the morning that was the most important thing to me. So really after that is when I decided to um, get more into the coyote spirit and trying to figure out specifically what it meant for me within that dream. And then a few days later, I saw a, unfortunately, but it was gorgeous and huge coyote on the side of the road when I was traveling. It was hit by a car, and weirdly enough, I kind of always make these mental notes whenever I see roadkill, but this one specifically was honestly like had to be the biggest coyote I've ever seen. I have a 75-pound husky and it like honestly seemed bigger than him. So yeah, and I had to just start paying attention to this. And I even told Charlene, from Witchy Work Wishes, I was like, hey, this is something important. So she kind of helped me and we started to read into it more. So, the thing about working with animal spirits is that they don't operate according to human timing or convenience. They show up when you need their teachings, not necessarily when you're looking for them, and they communicate through the channels you're most likely to notice and understand. For some people, animal spirits might communicate through dreams or meditation. Others might receive messages through animal behavior or unusual encounters. For me, roadkill has always been one of the primary ways. I don't want to say entirely roadkill, but just seeing the dead animal. Sorry if that's a little bit morbid, but that is really just been one of the primary ways ever since I was young that animal spirits got my attention. I've learned not to question this channel eventually, but to pay careful attention to what is being communicated. When I see roadkill, I don't just drive past. I take note of what animal, where it happened, what I was thinking about at the time, what questions I've been holding. I look for patterns and messages, and when this coyote, the message was clear. It's time to learn from us. But recognizing a calling is different from understanding it. Just because an animal spirit is trying to get your attention doesn't mean you automatically know what they're trying to teach you. That requires deeper investigation, careful observation, and the willingness to be changed by what you discover. So I started paying attention differently after that roadside encounter. I began researching coyote behavior, not just the basic facts. I've always kind of known the basic facts. I live in a pretty urban area in California, and coyotes are very, very prevalent. So quite a lot of people here know the basic facts about them. Um, but I really wanted to know the deeper patterns. I've always been super interested in wolves and other canids, but I wanted to truly get into coyote and how they solve problems, how they adapt to new environments, how they communicate with each other and other species, how they survive and they thrive in conditions that other predators can't handle. And what I discovered was that coyotes embody a form of intelligence that's perfectly suited to our current historical moment. They're not stranger than wolves or more ferocious than mountain lions, but they're more adaptable, more creative, more willing to experiment with new approaches when old ones stop working. And this flexibility isn't weakness. It's a sophisticated survival strategy that allows them to thrive in rapidly changing environments. And for those of us trying to practice authentic magic in an increasingly complex world, this adaptability has everything to teach us. One of the most important things to understand about coyotes is that they are fundamentally boundary crossers. They don't just live at the edges between human and wild spaces, they actively navigate and exploit these boundary zones. In magical terms, this makes them natural psychopomps and liminal workers. They understand something essential about the nature of thresholds, transitions, and the power that exists in between states. So, traditional ecological wisdom talks about edge facts, and this is the phenomenon where the boundaries between different ecosystems are often the most biodiverse and productive areas. The place where forest meets meadow, where land meets water, where different habitats intersect. These spaces actually support more species and are more complex in their interactions than either habitat alone. And coyotes have mastered this principle. They don't try to dominate any single environment completely. Instead, they position themselves at the intersections where they can take advantage of resources and opportunities from multiple ecosystems. This has profound implications for magical practice. Most of us are taught to think in terms of categories and boundaries, light magic versus dark magic, traditional versus modern approaches, solitary versus community practice, but coyote wisdom suggests a different approach. Real power often lies in the spaces between the categories, in the ability to draw from multiple sources, to adapt techniques from different traditions, to work in the gray areas where most people are afraid to venture. I've started applying this principle to, my own magical work in concrete ways instead of trying to be, purely traditional or completely innovative. I position myself at the intersection of historical knowledge and even contemporary application. Instead of choosing between different magical traditions, I learned from whatever sources offer useful techniques and perspectives. I've always kind of been the person who built my practice on what works and not necessarily trying to fit in any box. So really, this kind of made sense for me and fit like a puzzle piece. This boundary crossing approach requires a different kind of courage that you know, um, then specialized mastery. It becomes being comfortable with ambiguity, uncertainty, criticism from people who prefer clear categories and rigid definitions. It really speaks to the whole jack of all trades thing. And I know that saying is longer than just a jack of all trades, the master of none, but I digress. Coyotes face this same challenge. They're often criticized for not being pure predators or proper pack animals. They don't fit neatly into the categories that humans use to understand wild animals. And this makes some people uncomfortable, but their refusal to be categorized is exactly what makes them so successful. They can hunt alone when necessary and cooperate when beneficial. They can eat meat when it's available and survive on fruits and insects when it's not. They can be active during the day or the night, depending on what the situation requires. And this flexibility extends to their relationship with human environments. While other predators either completely avoid human spaces or become dependent on human resources, like our little raccoon friends, coyotes maintain their wild nature while learning to navigate civilization. They've figured out how to use human infrastructure for their own purposes without losing their essential wildness. They cross roads, hunt in parks, den under bridges, yet fundamentally, coyote is their thinking and behavior. For magical practitioners, this offers a powerful model for maintaining authentic spiritual practice while living in modern technological society. How do you stay connected to natural cycles while working in air conditioned offices? How do you practice ancient techniques while using contemporary tools? Or how do you maintain wild consciousness while participating in a civilized society? This coyote medicine suggests that the answer isn't choosing one or the other, but learning to navigate the boundaries between them, to be equally comfortable in the wilderness and the city, equally skilled at traditional and innovative approaches, and equally capable of working alone or with others as the situation demands. This boundary crossing ability also extends to their relationship with death and life. Coyotes are both predators and they are scavengers. They'll hunt fresh prey when they can, but they're equally willing to feed on carrion when and if that is available. This isn't laziness or opportunism in any negative sense. It's a sophisticated understanding that life and death are part of a continuous cycle and that refusing to work with any part of that cycle limits your effectiveness. And in magical terms, this translates to being willing to work with both a creative and destructive forces, both beginning and ending energies, both growth and decay processes. Many magical practitioners, are comfortable working with life affirming energies, but often are squeamish about death, magic, or baneful work. And Coyote Wisdom suggests that this squeamishness is a limitation, truly. True magical maturity requires being able to work with the full spectrum of natural forces, understanding that destruction is often necessary for creation and that endings enable beginnings. So, if there's one quality that defines coyotes more than any other, it's their extraordinary adaptability. But this isn't just behavioral flexibility, it's this fundamental approach to existence that treats adaptation as a sacred practice. Over the past century, while other large predators have seen their ranges shrink dramatically, coyotes have expanded from their original habitat in the western United States to occupy virtually every ecosystem in North America. They've colonized cities, suburbs, forests, deserts, even tundra environments they've never even lived in before. This expansion isn't the result of random wandering. It's a systematic process of experimentation. It's learning and it's cultural transmission. Coyotes who encounter new environments don't just try to impose their existing behavior patterns, they experiment with new approaches. They observe with what works and pass successful innovations on to their offspring. This is a magical thinking in its most practical, the willingness to experiment with new approaches when old ones stop working, the ability to observe results without emotional attachment to specific methods, the wisdom to adapt your practice to changing circumstances rather than trying to force circumstances to match your practice. I've been applying this coyote approach to my own magical development, and the results have honestly been remarkable. Instead of trying to maintain any sort of rigid consistency within my practice, I've started treating adaptation and experimentation as spiritual disciplines in their own right. So, coyote wisdom really challenges this approach of thinking you have to have all these proper ingredients for it to work or the correct time. These animals don't wait for perfect hunting conditions. They work with whatever conditions exist. They don't refuse to hunt because their preferred prey isn't available. They learn to hunt whatever prey species are present. So I also want to talk about how authenticity kind of works its way into here. Coyote medicine suggests that authenticity lies not in perfect replication of historical forms, but in maintaining the essential spirit in the function while adapting the form to current realities. For instance, if the traditional purpose of a particular ritual was to align with seasonal cycles, the authentic approach might be to create new forms that serve that same purpose in your current environment rather than trying to replicate historical forms that were designed for different climates and landscapes. This adaptive approach also extends to learning itself. Coyotes are remarkable for their ability to learn from other species. They observe and they mimic successful behaviors from wolves, foxes, birds, even humans when those behaviors prove useful in their environment. This cross species learning challenges the tribal thinking that often limits magical development. Many practitioners become so identified with particular traditions or lineages that they refuse to learn from other sources even when those sources offer valuable insights and techniques. Coyote wisdom suggests a more pragmatic approach. Learn from whoever and whatever has something useful to teach, regardless of their background or their credentials. Test everything against your own direct experience. Adopt what works and discard what doesn't. This doesn't mean being indiscriminate or disrespectful about cultural boundaries. It means approaching learning with the kind of intelligent opportunism that allows coyotes to thrive in environments where more specialized predators fail. So now I want to talk about the shadow side of coyote energy because any honest discussion of working with these spirits has to acknowledge the aspects that make people uncomfortable. And coyotes represent qualities that our culture often demonizes: opportunism, cunning, and the ability and willingness to break rules when necessary for survival. In many human communities, coyotes are seen as pests, threats, and nuisances. They kill pets, they raid garbage cans, they hunt livestock. They don't respect the boundaries humans try to establish between wild and domestic spaces, and this reputation colors how people think about their spiritual significance. But here's what's important to understand. The qualities that make humans uncomfortable with coyotes are often the same qualities that enable their remarkable survival and adaptability. And these qualities have important lessons for medical practitioners willing to look beyond surface judgments. Let's take opportunism for example. In human culture, we often treat this opportunism as a character flaw, something maybe selfish or unprincipled. But from a coyote perspective, opportunism is simply intelligent resource management. Why work harder than necessary when easier options are available? Why pass up beneficial opportunities because they don't fit your preconceived plans? Most magical practitioners are taught to approach their practice with elaborate planning, rigid structures, and resistance to deviation from established protocols. But Coyote Energy suggests a different approach. Stay alert for unexpected opportunities and be ready to pivot when circumstances change. I've learned to apply this opportunistic thinking to my magical work in certain ways that have significantly increased its effectiveness. So we can really learn to apply this opportunistic thinking to all of your magical work in ways that, can significantly increase its effectiveness. Instead of always waiting for perfect conditions or following predetermined plans, you can learn to recognize and work with the magical opportunities that present themselves in each moment. This opportunistic approach requires developing what I think of as this magical presence, the ability to remain alert to spiritual opportunities and ready to act on them without extensive preparation or planning. Another uncomfortable aspect of coyote energy is their relationship with deception and cunning. Coyotes are masters of misdirection. They'll pretend to be injured to lead threats away from their dens. They will work in coordinated teams or packs where some individuals distract prey while others position themselves for the kill. From a human moral perspective, we might call this dishonesty, but from survival perspective, it's simply intelligent strategy. And in magical terms, it points to important principles about working with perception, illusion, and the manipulation of appearances. Much of effective magic involves changing how situations are perceived and understood. Glamour magic works by altering others' perceptions of you. Protection magic often works by making yourself less visible to potential threats, and influence magic frequently involves subtle shifts in how people think about situations. Coyote Energy teaches the ethical use of these deceptive techniques. The key is understanding the difference between manipulation for selfish gain and strategic deception for protection and survival. Coyotes don't lie for the pleasure of lying or to harm others unnecessarily. They use this deception strategically when it serves legitimate needs like protecting their young, securing necessary resources, and avoiding unnecessary conflicts. This principle translates directly to magical practice. There are times when concealing your magical work serves important purposes, like protecting yourself from interference or persecution, avoiding unwanted attention that might compromise your effectiveness, preventing others from projecting their fears and doubts onto your practice. Learning when and how to work in concealment is an important magical skill that many practitioners never develop because they're uncomfortable with anything that feels like deception. But Coyote Wisdom teaches that strategic concealment is often necessary for effective magical work. The shadow aspect of Coyote energy also includes their willingness to break social rules when those rules conflict with survival needs. Coyotes don't recognize human property boundaries when they're hunting food for their families. They don't observe human schedules when they need to move through territory for their safety. And this rule breaking tendency can be deeply uncomfortable for people who are heavily invested in social approval and conventional behavior. But for most magical practitioners, it offers, important insights about when conventional rules serve life and when they obstruct it. There are times in your practice when following conventional social rules will prevent you from doing what needs to be done. That's just a fact. Times when being polite and socially acceptable will keep you from protecting yourself or others from genuine harm. Times when respecting other people's comfort levels will prevent you from accessing or expressing your authentic power. And Coyote Energy teaches the art of strategic rule breaking, understanding which rules serve genuine ethical purposes and which are simply social conventions that can be violated when necessary without causing any real harm. This doesn't mean becoming randomly rebellious or antisocial. It means developing the discernment to distinguish between rules that protect life and the well being and rules that simply maintain social comfort and conventional appearances. Okay, so I kind of want to go back to the death magic and the roadkill. I want to address something that might make some listeners uncomfortable, but I really don't give a fuck. So, it's definitely essential to understand how animal spirits communicate. The spiritual significance of roadkill and animal death as a form of magical communication. Throughout my years of practice, I've noticed that animal spirits often get my attention through encounters with death. And this is important for me to talk about because I think it's going to help everyone discern when an animal spirit or when a sign is a sign and when it's just truly not a sign. Not because, you know, death is negative or tragic, but because it represents a threshold moment when the boundaries between physical and spiritual worlds become thin and permeable. For me, I've just noticed this is how I receive my signs. When I encounter roadkill or uh, not even roadkill, just a dead animal, I don't see it as mere accident or unfortunate circumstance most of the time. There's a small percent where obviously it just is what it is. I see it as a potential message from, the spirit world about things that I need to understand, that I need to pay attention to or learn from. This perspective might seem morbid or superstitious to people who view death primarily as tragedy or failure, but in many traditional cultures, death is understood as a natural transition that often carries important spiritual information. And the coyote that I encountered on the roadside wasn't just a random casualty of modern transportation. It was a teaching moment about the risks and the benefits of crossing boundaries between certain things that are happening in my personal life. And coyotes live at the edge of these worlds by choice. They benefit from the opportunities that human civilization provides, like food sources, dining sites, reduced competition from larger predators. But they also face the dangers that come with the proximity to human infrastructure, vehicles, hunting pressure, habitat fragmentation. From a magical perspective, this roadkill encounter was teaching me about the price of boundary crossing, about the courage required to work between worlds, and about the reality that spiritual evolution sometimes involves risk and sacrifice. Working with animal spirits through death encounters requires developing a different relationship with, mortality than most modern people are comfortable with. It means seeing death not as a failure or tragedy, but as a transition, as transformation, and sometimes sacrifice for greater understanding. This doesn't mean being callous about suffering or cavalier about loss. It means recognizing that in the living universe, death feeds life, and endings enable beginnings, and sacrifice sometimes serves spiritual purposes that transcend individual survival. When I work with roadkill encounters magically, I follow a specific protocol. I take note of what animal, where the encounter happened, perhaps even what the body looks like, how it died, what I was thinking about at the time, what questions I've been holding in my practice, and I offer gratitude and absolute respect to the spirit of the animal. I ask what message or teaching they might have for me, and I truly send all the energy that I can for them to reach the space that they need to on their own journey. And I pay attention to the thoughts, the images, or the insights that arise in response. With the coyote, the message was clear and immediate. It's time to learn about adaptation and boundary crossing and what that means for me in my life. Time to understand how to navigate between worlds without losing your essential nature, and time to develop the courage to take calculated risks for spiritual growth. This form of divination through death encounters has become one of the most reliable and powerful forms of spiritual communication for me personally in my practice. Animal spirits seem to use these threshold moments when their consciousness is transitioning between physical and spiritual existence to communicate important information to those willing to listen. But working with death magic requires emotional and spiritual maturity. You have to be able to encounter death without being overwhelmed by grief, by fear, or revulsion. You have to understand that honoring an animal's death through spiritual work doesn't minimize the tragedy of their physical loss. You also have to be careful not to romanticize or appropriate death for your spiritual purposes without genuinely caring about the well being of living animals and their habitats. Coyote death magic specifically teaches about the relationship between risk and growth, between safety and stagnation. Coyotes who never leave their original territory might live longer, but will never develop the skills and knowledge that come from exploring new environments. Similarly, magical practitioners who never leave their comfort zones, never experiment with new techniques, never venture into unfamiliar spiritual territory, might maintain safety, but will never develop the depth and the power that come from genuine spiritual adventure. The roadkill coyote was teaching me about the necessity of taking calculated risks for spiritual development, about the courage required to cross between familiar and unfamiliar territory, and about the reality that growth often requires leaving the safety of what you already know. This lesson has influenced, every aspect of my magical practice since that encounter, and I've been more willing to experiment with new techniques, more open to unfamiliar forms of spiritual communication, more courageous about sharing my practice with others despite the risks of, misunderstanding or criticism. And working with Coyote Death Magic has also taught me about the importance of honoring sacrifice in spiritual practice. These animals die, sometimes in service of human understanding and growth. The least that I can do is receive their teachings with respect, integrate their wisdom into my life, and use what I learn to serve the larger web of life that they are a part of. So, one of the most misunderstood aspects of coyote behavior is their social structure. Popular culture often portrays them as solitary creatures, but the reality is much more complex and interesting. Coyotes can work alone when necessary, and yes, while they are primarily solitary animals, they are very cooperative when beneficial. They form temporary partnerships for specific purposes, and more often in urban areas, you actually do see them running in quite large packs. And they maintain long term family bonds that persist across years. This flexibility in social organization has profound implication for magical practitioners, especially those who work primarily alone but occasionally collaborate with others. Unlike wolves, who are obligate pack animals, they, struggle to survive without their social group. Coyotes can function very effectively as individuals. A single coyote can hunt successfully, defend their territory, and raise young if necessary. But they also understand when cooperation serves their interests. During certain seasons or in specific environments, coyotes will form hunting partnerships or family groups that allow them to take down larger prey or defend resources more effectively. So, this ability to shift between solitary and collaborative modes depending on circumstances is a sophisticated survival strategy that many magical practitioners could learn from. Too often, we get locked into rigid patterns, especially if you've been practicing for a little while, of either always working alone, I am guilty as charged, or always working in groups. But coyote energy teaches a more flexible approach. So really, I want to talk about the working with coyote energy in solitary practice, just because I'm a solely solitary practitioner, which I do want to do an episode on, but again, I digress. W- So, particularly with coyote energy in the solitary practice, this involves developing what I kind of think of as pack of one consciousness. This means cultivating the self reliance and the individual competence that allows you to function effectively alone while maintaining the social intelligence and cooperative abilities that allow you to work with others when beneficial. The self reliance aspect involves developing the full range of magical skills so you're not dependent on others for essential capabilities. This includes, your energy work, your protection, divination, healing, influence magic, whatever skills you need to handle the challenges that arise in your life and your practice. But it also involves developing the kind of emotional and spiritual independence that allows you to trust your own judgment, follow your own guidance, and maintain your own standards regardless of what others think or do. The cooperative aspect involves maintaining the social skills and the ability to work harmoniously with others when circumstances call for it. And this means being able to communicate clearly, share your resources fairly, and contribute to group efforts without losing your individual identity or authority. And coyotes excel at this balance. They can hunt alone with complete competence, but when they encounter prey too large for an individual to handle, they can quickly organize cooperative hunting strategies. They maintain their individual identities and abilities while contributing to group efforts. And this approach requires a different kind of ego structure than either pure solitary practice or complete group immersion. You have to be secure enough in your individual abilities that you don't need constant validation from others, but flexible enough to recognize when collaboration serves your purposes. Working with Coyote Energy has also taught me about the importance of maintaining what I call, strategic relationships. These are connections with other practitioners that are based on mutual respect and occasional collaboration rather than constant interaction or emotional dependency. These relationships allow you to call on others when you need specific assistance or when group work would be more effective than a solo practice. But they don't require daily maintenance, constant communication, or ongoing social obligations. This model of magic relationship, reflects coyote social patterns. This loose network of individuals who maintain their independence but can coordinate when circumstances require it. It's a more sustainable and flexible model than either complete isolation or intensive group membership. So, now let's get into the practical aspects of working with coyote energy. These are techniques that I've kind of developed through direct experience and observation, not borrowed from other sources or traditions. And one of the most powerful applications of coyote energy is in rituals designed to help you adapt to changing circumstances or develop new capabilities. And ideally, as a human, you should always be adapting and developing new capabilities. But when I'm facing a situation that requires me to learn new skills or adjust to unfamiliar environments, I like to perform what I call an adaptation ritual. And this is extremely useful for coyote energy. This involves creating, your sacred space, particularly in a liminal environment, somewhere that bridges in different worlds together. Urban parks can work, riversides, forest edges, any place where, different ecosystems or environments meet. If you're the type of practitioner who really just doesn't go out or doesn't feel comfortable, one thing that I tend to lean on, especially if I really don't want to get up at 12 a.m. and go somewhere, is sit within the threshold of a door. It works just as good. And you can begin by calling on the coyote spirit, not as an external deity, but as an aspect of consciousness. We just talked about shapeshifting, and you can integrate a lot of those practices into this as well. And you can request that it work through you. Explain the situation that you're facing and ask for guidance in developing the flexibility and the intelligence needed to navigate it successfully. Then spend some time observing your environment with coyote eyes, kind of looking for opportunities, resources, and connections that you might have missed with ordinary human perception. Particularly pay attention to what adaptations the local plants and animals have made to thrive in this specific location. There's a lot to learn with the natural world around us. The ritual concludes with a commitment to approach by a challenge with coyote consciousness. Staying alert for unexpected opportunities, being willing to experiment with new approaches, and maintain the flexibility when your circumstances change. You can also work on boundary crossing with coyotes. Again, they are natural psychopomps, and working with their energy can be particularly effective for magic that involves crossing between different states of consciousness or different worlds. For astral projection, your trance journeying, or other forms of consciousness travel, invoking the coyote energy as a guide and a protector. You can choose to have a coyote as your guide or even as a servitor. You can work with this in so many different ways when it comes to consciousness. Coyotes understand how to navigate unfamiliar territory safely while maintaining connection to their home base. Visualize yourself taking on a coyote form, even, or traveling with a coyote companion when doing this kind of work. The coyote energy helps you stay alert to dangers. It helps you find safe pathways through unfamiliar territory and specifically return safely to your ordinary consciousness. And this technique has been particularly useful for dream work and lucid dreaming. Coyotes are naturally liminal creatures who are active during dawn and dusk, the threshold times between day and night, and their energy helps maintain awareness during the threshold state between waking and the sleeping consciousness. Obviously, you can start to work with them with opportunistic magic, which is the ability to recognize and work with magical opportunities as they arise rather than, relying solely on planned rituals. And then there's stealth magic. Another practical application of this coyote energy is developing the ability to work magic in plain sight without attracting unwanted attention. And this particularly is useful for practitioners who live or work in environments where open magic practice would be, say, problematic. Coyotes are masters of moving through human environments without being noticed. They use cover, timing, and misdirection to avoid detection while accomplishing their goals. You can adapt these stealth practices for all sorts of things in your magical work. Learning to perform energy work during seemingly ordinary activities, using everyday objects as magical tools in ways that aren't obvious to untrained observers, and timing magical work to coincide with moments when others are distracted or absent. Their stealth approach has several advantages. It protects your practice from interference or persecution, and it allows you to work magic in situations where obvious ritual would be inappropriate. And it develops your ability to access magical consciousness without external triggers or supports. And kind of lastly, perhaps one of the most valuable practical application of coyote energy is in developing magical approaches to problem solving. Coyotes are incredibly resourceful and creative when it comes to overcoming objects and obstacles. Just like corvids, they are just extremely smart. When I encounter a problem that seems intractable, I approach it with, coyote mind. What would Coyote do instead of what would Jesus do? Looking for unconventional solutions. Consider approaches that others might overlook. Be willing to work around obstacles rather than trying to overpower them. That is a big one. A lot of us are so used to white knuckling or just pushing through things and forcing it. And really, what we can learn from Coyote here is working around and working with things. You know, this kind of, for me, when I talk about the moon phases and how we feel this energetic pull and this push and this ebb and flow, especially to those of us who are more connected to it, and we really truly feel our emotions fluctuate with the moon phases. There are good times and there are absolutely bad times. And when you're in that state of having a particularly hard time, say because of the full moon or the new moon or certain astrological events, instead of just getting through it like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna freaking coffee up and I'm gonna do this and I'm just gonna push through these feelings. The most valuable thing I have ever learned in my magical practice in these times is to roll with the tides. And for me, I literally picture being in the ocean that is being pulled by the moon, like your wave of emotions, and just riding with it inside those waves and using it to your advantage instead of just trying to swim against the current. And coyote energy teaches us that there's almost always more than one way to accomplish any goal. This involves reframing the problem entirely. Instead of acting or asking, how do I defeat this obstacle? It's how do I accomplish my goal despite this obstacle? Or how can I turn this apparent limitation into an advantage? If this direct approach isn't working, look for indirect approaches. If confrontation isn't effective, try misdirection. If resistance is met with greater resistance, try yielding and redirecting the energy. A lot of us have a hard time with yielding to things in this modern age. This problem solving approach has applications far beyond magical practice. It's useful in career situations, relationship challenges, health issues, any area of life where flexibility and creative thinking can help you navigate difficulties. And then, there's integration practices. Working with Coyote energy effectively requires ongoing integration practices that help you embody the Coyote consciousness in your daily life rather than just accessing it during ritual. Spend time each day observing your environment with Coyote awareness. We just talked about this with the shape shifting. Look for opportunities, resources, and connections that you might normally miss. Practice moving through urban environments with the kind of alert awareness that coyotes maintain when navigating human territory, and practice what, you could call like coyote decision making. Evaluate choices based on practical effectiveness rather than the social expectations or a conventional morality. This doesn't mean becoming unethical, but it does mean being willing to choose approaches that serve your genuine needs, even when they don't conform to other people's expectations. These integration practices, help coyote consciousness become a natural part of your worldview rather than something you only access during your magical work. Over time, this creates a fundamental shift in how you approach challenges and opportunities in all areas of your life. So, as we reach the conclusion of this exploration, I want to address what it means to truly live with coyote consciousness rather than just, again, accessing it when it's available. Working with animal spirits isn't just about borrowing their qualities when convenient, it's about allowing their way of being in the world fundamentally change how you approach existence. And coyote consciousness offers a particularly relevant model for navigating our current historical moment. We live in times of unprecedented change and uncertainty, environmental collapse, technological disruption, social upheaval, and economic instability. The old ways of doing things aren't working anymore, but the new ways just haven't fully emerged yet. And this is exactly the kind of environment where coyote consciousness becomes essential. The ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions, the skill to find opportunities where others see only problems, and the resilience to survive and thrive in these unstable conditions. Living the coyote path means developing these capabilities not just as magical techniques, but as fundamental life skills. The first aspect of coyote consciousness, is what you can call adaptive intelligence, the ability to learn new approaches quickly when the old ones stop working. This requires a fundamental shift away from attachment to specific methods and toward commitment to underlying purposes. In my own life, this has meant learning to hold goals and values firmly while remaining flexible about the methods I use to achieve them. I always say, I always have a plan, even if the plan changes 5 times a day, there's always a plan. And, when circumstances change, I ask myself, what am I really trying to accomplish here? And what new approaches might serve that purpose better under current conditions? This adaptive approach extends to everything from career decisions to spiritual practices to relationship dynamics. And instead of trying to force circumstances to match my preferences, I've learned to adapt my approach to work effectively with whatever circumstances actually exist. The second aspect is strategic opportunism, the ability to recognize and capitalize on opportunities as they arise, even when those opportunities don't match your original plans. Coyotes are incredibly good at this. They don't waste energy pursuing unavailable resources or laminating missed opportunities. They stay alert for whatever opportunities actually present themselves and adjust their behavior accordingly. You can apply the same approach to opportunities in your life instead of being so focused on specific goals that miss unexpected possibilities. Maintain awareness of larger purposes while staying open to alternative paths that might serve those purposes more effectively. This has led to some of the most significant and positive changes in my life. Opportunities I never could have planned, but, was able to recognize and act on because I was maintaining this awareness. And then there's boundary fluidity. The third aspect is this boundary fluidity, the ability to work in the spaces between categories, to cross between different worlds and ways of being without losing your essential nature. For me, this, well, means a lot of things, but, also learning to be equally comfortable in mundane and magical contexts, in urban and natural environments, in solitary and even social situations. Instead of having separate magical and ordinary selves, I've learned to integrate magical consciousness into all aspects of my life. This integration allows me to work magic through ordinary activities, to find spiritual meaning in mundane circumstances, to serve as a bridge between people who live primarily in conventional reality and those who are aware of deeper mysteries. And then we have resilient independence, the ability to rely on your own resources and judgment while remaining open to collaboration when it serves your purposes. Living the Coyote consciousness can mean developing the full range of skills needed to handle whatever challenges arise in your life. And this includes practical skills like problem solving, resource management, and crisis navigation, as well as psychological skills like emotional regulation, stress tolerance, and adaptive thinking. But it also means maintaining the social intelligence to work with others when collaboration serves your goals. And the key is approaching relationships from a position of strength rather than need. As someone who chooses to collaborate rather than someone who needs others to survive. The fifth aspect of this coyote energy is ethical flexibility, the ability to make moral decisions based on real world consequences rather than abstract principles or social expectations. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of coyote consciousness for people who are used to following clear moral rules, but coyote wisdom teaches that rigid ethical systems often fail when circumstances become complex or unusual. Living with coyote consciousness means developing the ability to make ethical decisions based on the specific situation at hand, considering all the relevant factors and potential consequences rather than simply following predetermined rules. And this doesn't mean abandoning all moral principles. It means holding your deepest values, things like protecting life, preventing unnecessary suffering, supporting growth and healing, while remaining flexible about the methods you choose to serve those values. Finally, choosing coyote energy means developing what I call the long view and the ability to see current challenges and opportunities within the context of larger evolutionary processes. And this means, coyotes have survived and thrived for millions of years by maintaining this long-term perspective. Millions of years? Did I just say that? Have coyotes been around for millions of years? Anyway, they don't panic during difficult seasons or become complacent during easy times. They understand that both challenges and opportunities are temporary, and they position themselves to benefit from long-term trends rather than just reacting to immediate circumstances. And for magical practitioners, this long view is essential. It helps you understand your individual practice and development within the context of a larger spiritual evolution. It allows you to weather difficult periods without losing faith and to make the most of beneficial periods without taking them for granted. Living with this coyote consciousness has fundamentally changed how I know I approach every aspect of my life, and it's made me more resilient during difficult times, most effective during productive periods, and more satisfied with life in general because I'm able to find opportunities and meaning in circumstances that might otherwise seem limiting or even frustrating. And perhaps more importantly, it's connected me to a way of being that feels ancient and authentic. It's a reminder that humans are part of the natural world and that we have access to the same intelligence and adaptability that allows other species to thrive in changing environments. The coyotes are still calling, in dreams and roadside encounters, literally in the middle of the night, and in the liminal spaces where human and wild worlds intersect. They're offering teachings that our species desperately needs as we navigate an uncertain future. And the only question is whether we are ready to listen and learn from these urban magical spirits who have mastered the art of thriving in impossible conditions. So, as I bring this to a close, I'm really struck by how much coyote consciousness mirrors the path of the modern magical practitioner. Like coyotes, we exist within the margins between worlds. Like them, we must learn to adapt ancient wisdom to our contemporary circumstances. And like them, we often face a misunderstanding and absolute resistance from those who prefer clear categories and predictable behaviors. And like them, our survival and effectiveness depend on our ability to remain flexible, alert, and true to our essential nature while constantly adapting our methods to serve that nature in changing circumstances. So, the coyote teachings I've talked about today aren't just about working with animal spirits in magical practice. They're about developing a fundamentally different relationship with change, uncertainty, and challenge. They're about learning to see opportunities with others, see only problems, to find resources in unexpected places, to thrive in conditions that defeat those who are less adaptable. This wisdom is desperately needed in our current world, and we need people who can think like coyotes, who can navigate between different worlds of being, who can adapt quickly to changing conditions, and who can find creative solutions to unprecedented problems. And especially, we need magical practitioners who can work effectively in urban environments as well as natural ones, who can serve the healing of our world through whatever circumstances they find themselves in, and who can maintain their spiritual energy and integrity while engaging with the practical demands of contemporary life. The coyotes have been our teachers all along. They've been showing us by example how to be wild in civilization, how to be authentic in artificial environments, and how to be resilient in the face of constant change. But they can only teach those who are willing to listen without judgment, to learn without prejudice, and to be challenged and to be changed by what they discover. If you feel called to work with coyote energy, start by observing them, not just their obvious behaviors, but their approach to existence. Notice how they assess situations, how they make decisions, how they balance caution with boldness, independence, and with cooperation. Pay attention to your dreams and the animals you encounter in your daily life. Be, open to possibility that what looks like random occurrence may actually be maybe a spiritual communication. And most importantly, be willing to let their way of being in the world challenge and change your own. The greatest gifts that animal spirits offer aren't magical techniques or spiritual insights. They're whole new ways of understanding what it means to be alive, consciousness, and connected to the web of existence. The coyotes are waiting within the margins, in the spaces between certainties, and in the threshold places where transformation becomes possible. They're waiting to teach anyone who's ready to learn the ancient art of adaptation, the sacred practice of thriving in impossible conditions. So I want to thank you all for joining me on this little journey into the world of coyotes. And I hope some of you, or maybe hopefully all of you, can connect to them in some way. And until next time, wherever you are in the world, again, I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, and night.